The borders on my definition of what it meant to be pro-life really kind of started to expand. And it was because of my anchoring in the belief of the dignity and sanctity of every human life, and how being against abortion was not enough.
Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. In this season, we're talking about how we can respond to the brokenness in our own lives and in our society with our heads, hearts, and hands. Before I tell you about today's conversation, I have some quick announcements. One, we've just put together a new resource. It's a paperback version of Head, Heart, Hands and discussion guides for white picket fences. We also have a new paperback version of Missing Out on Beautiful. It's a collection of essays about growing up with a child with Down syndrome, written by Penny and me. You can find these on my website, amyjuliabecker.com, under the resources tab. And I did just want to mention that we are now posting all of these podcast conversations on my YouTube channel, so you can listen there or share them from there. But as for today's episode, I am just really excited for you to get to hear from Briana Stensrud. I first met Bri a few years ago. She invited me to join a small group of Christian women who are bloggers and writers. We went on a trip to visit El Paso, Texas, and Juarez, Mexico, in order to get an inside look at what is happening along our southern border. I got to tell you a little bit about that trip in the interview, but in sum, it just helped me get a really much more comprehensive framework for the issues involved in the debates over immigration, the way immigration has changed in the past 20 years, especially along our southern border, and how we haven't necessarily caught up to that change as a society. It helped me understand why, as a person of faith, these issues really matter to me and are something I want to be involved in, even if I'm involved in small ways. I hope our conversation will be informative and also will help to give you what Bri would call both compassion and confidence in moving forward as people who extend welcome to the stranger. Over the course of the past few months on this podcast, we've been looking at different areas of social division. So we've talked about race and disability and politics, but we have not touched on the issues surrounding immigration. And honestly, immigration is a topic that I think many of us who are American citizens don't think that much about. I also think it's a topic that deserves our attention. And that's true for listeners of this podcast, at least, for a couple of reasons. One, we're talking about social divisions, and this is a divisive issue politically here in the United States. Two, it's actually a divisive social issue in the sense that immigrants to this country and citizens of this country are often seen and treated differently. But finally, for anyone who seeks wisdom and truth from the Bible, the consistent emphasis throughout Scripture on welcoming the foreigner, the stranger, the alien, those are different words used in Scripture for the immigrant, that emphasis means we need to understand what extending welcome would look like in our political, social, and current context. So it's time to talk about immigration. And to get that conversation started, I have invited Briana Stensrud, Director of Women of Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today, Bri.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Bri, I'd love for you to introduce yourself here and tell us how you became the Director of Women of Welcome. Tell us about the organization and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's actually just a crazy journey, actually. I started out in the traditional kind of pro-life world where I was advocating and had a job that had me traveling around the country recruiting families for kids who were languishing in foster care. I was working to place ultrasound machines in high-risk abortion communities. I was working to write resources and all the kinds of tools that pregnancy resource centers would need and medical clinics. And I was also tasked with just kind of writing content about being pro-life and diving into Scripture and kind of helping our constituency. I was working for Focus on the Family at the time, and I was the director of Sanctity of Human Life Initiative. So I was writing content about all of these kind of human dignity issues, and I was tasked to kind of connect them all together from a biblical perspective. And really, that kind of started me on this journey of seeing the interconnectedness of all of these different vulnerable populations along the spectrum of life. Yeah. And my heart and my head, it all just kind of like started, the borders on my definition of what it meant to be pro-life really kind of started to expand.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because of my anchoring in the belief of the dignity and sanctity of every human life, and how being against abortion was not enough. It was being for the vulnerable mother. It was about healthcare. It was about all of these things that actually support someone who makes a choice for life, and all of these things. So to me, the immigration conversation was very important, but it was more of a distant subject matter to me. It was something I advocated for and told others was important, but I hadn't taken a deep dive into it myself. But I was actually invited to go across the border on a trip with Women of Welcome when it was first starting out. And I was asked to film a documentary with Latasha Morrison, who's on Be the Bridge, and Heather McFadden, who's another podcast, I'm sure you know. And so we all went over and we toured migrant facilities, and we visited with local government, the Border Patrol. We had all these meetings, and I literally found myself in the room of an unaccompanied migrant shelter, children's shelter. And I found myself in a room just sobbing. And for context, we had just met all these children who had lost their parents. They were in Mexico, in Oaxaca, Mexico. And either they had lost their parents, or they'd been separated from their parents, or their parents had asked them to go along because they thought that they could find a better life outside of violence and poverty if they went on this journey by themselves. And I had met a mom age 12, met a mom age 15, both holding babies under a year old. And I couldn't handle it being a mother myself. And so I found myself in a room bawling, just crying my eyes out. And the leader of the trip kind of came in the room, and she kind of walked back out, like, like just letting me cry. And another woman came in, and she was really concerned. And she, oh my goodness, are you okay? Well, the leader of the trip, she walked in, she said, just leave her alone. She needs a minute. She's just grieving what she's missed. And it was it's exactly what it was. It was, the power of proximity is so great and so huge. And it makes these wonderful shifts in our hearts and our minds. And she was right. I was grieving the fact that as a self-identified evangelical and a Christian, how much the church had missed this issue, and how much we had missed the vulnerability of this population, of this region of people that were made in the image of God, and we were just discarding them and labeling them in such horrific and dehumanizing ways that I was like lamenting in the corner of this room. And that's kind of how I got involved. I got back from the trip, and I was asked to take over the whole project, which was like, hello, I'm the newest person to this. But it was kind of this sense of, there was a shift in me. And I think folks on the trip could see there was a big shift in me that said, this is a community of people that I need to really invest in. So here I am.
How long ago was that? When did that happen?
That happened, I was on a trip, I think 2.5, maybe 3 years ago. And then of course you went on a trip. Right.
Okay. So that was, I didn't realize actually that it was that recently that you became director. I went on a trip, it was before COVID. So what, the fall of 2019, when you invited me to join a group of women to see what was happening on the border. And so we were in both El Paso and in Juarez, and it was just 24 hours. But again, as you said, the power of proximity, you did a wonderful job of showing us all sorts of different angles. We met with Border Patrol. We met with church leaders. We met with actual migrants who are trying to cross the border, and learned so much. And I wrote a series of different blog posts and articles about that trip. And obviously it impacted the other people we were with as well. And especially for someone from Connecticut, where immigration is not the same type of issue as it is, for example, in Texas or in some of the other border states. I was really compelled, though, just to recognize that as you were talking about, there's this big picture issue of what does it mean, especially for people in a nation that is powerful and wealthy, to use our power and wealth on behalf of the most vulnerable. And there are all sorts of people who fall into that category. And it's not to say that I'm not even one of those people in some ways, but at the same time, it was a transformational opportunity for me, and which is, again, part of why I wanted you to be here, because this season of the podcast we've called Head, Heart, Hands, because we're trying to approach some of these different divisive issues in a holistic way, so that we are able to understand the historical context and get information and just factual details about an issue, and then also connect with our hearts. So both spiritually and relationally connect, and then finally take meaningful action in response. And I would kind of like for our time together here to actually walk through the head, the heart, and the hands when it comes with this issue, it comes to this issue. So I'll start with the head. There's a lot to learn. I learned on the trip with you when it comes to immigration in America, because there's laws and terminology and a long history that I did not know all about. And I know we can't cover all of it, but I'm wondering if you could explain some of the basics for us. And I'm specifically wondering if you can explain what it means for someone to be a refugee or seeking asylum, and how that is different from other types of immigration.
Right. So you can be, so there is the term migrants, and migrants just describe people that are moving anywhere, like you migrated maybe from another state. Maybe you, like I've lived in certain states and I've moved to different places and I migrated to that state. So, any persons that is kind of moving about the world and the country are migrants. And someone who is an immigrant is somebody who is looking to I'm going to use real layman's terms here, but it's someone who is looking to go into another country, to immigrate to another country and work or start a new life or take advantage of economic opportunities there, reunite with family. So you have someone who's immigrating to the US, and I'll use it in our context and our purposes, just in kind of North America, US. Someone who's a refugee or someone who is seeking asylum. A refugee is somebody that is has gotten a certain status from the UN, and a refugee is someone who is fleeing persecution. So if you're a refugee, you can apply for asylum, an asylum in a country. Now, in our particular country, in the US, you either have to apply from that overseas, and the UN, and so the US has their own vetting purposes and their own vetting process, as well as the UN. So it's a very strict and really crazy and long vetting process for coming overseas. But if you're wanting to seek asylum in the US and you are claiming to be a refugee, you would present at our border at one of our legal ports of entry, and you would say, I am a refugee. I want to seek asylum here. And you may not have refugee status, but you might be coming from a country that there's known political persecution or increase in violence or whatever that may be, that would very easily categorize you as a refugee. Okay. So the two ways that you, again, specifically when people think about people who, especially the headlines as of late, when people think of those who are applying for asylum or looking to immigrate to the US, they're usually thinking of our southern border, right, instead of a global migration to the US in some way. So those who are seeking asylum in the US, you either have to be in the US to apply for that status, or you have to present at the border. And so you can illegally cross our border and present yourself to a Border Patrol agent and then ask to apply for asylum. Right. Or you can go to a legal port of entry and you can do that same thing there. So technically you can legally apply for asylum by illegally crossing our border, right, or presenting at a legal port of entry. Frankly, I think a lot of people think that, why are people making the journey? Can't they just apply at a US embassy or something like that? That's actually not available for people to do. Right now, our international and our national asylum laws say that you have to be in country in order to apply for that. So sometimes what you'll have people who apply for a visa, a tourist or a travel visa, and they come here and then they apply for asylum status and or refugee status in the US. Yeah. To seek asylum. So there's a lot, and it gets a little noodly, but basically what you see on the southern border is you have people who want to immigrate to the US, and And we've seen a shift in dynamics, as it used to be kind of like in the 80s and the 90s. There was this huge economic push to come to the US, and you would have single men in their 20s and 30s coming and trying to cross illegally into the country for economic opportunity. And what you're now seeing is you're seeing families that are coming from more of the Northern Triangle. Those single men that were coming before were really coming from Mexico.
Right.
And now in the last 10 years, we've been seeing this real huge influx. We've seen headlines of caravans and whatnot from the Northern Triangle area, and they're mostly made up of families. So the majority of them that are showing up at the border are showing up as families. And the difference is that the vast majority of them are not looking to cross the border illegally. What we see on Border Patrol footage is that these folks are trying to go to a port of entry, but our policies over the last several years have put in metering processes and all kinds of deterrents to try and actually get in a quote line. There's really not a line, but how you would present at a legal port of entry, we've had some deterring policies that have made that very difficult. So people would try and cross in between ports of entry. And what you can see on Border Patrol footage is that they are looking for the cameras so that they can find a camera and then sit and wait for a Border Patrol agent to actually come and pick them up, because they're not wanting to cross into the country illegally to then hide in the shadows, because that's what they've been doing in their home country. They've been hiding, they've been terrified, they've been living in fear, and they feel they have a valid claim that they are a refugee and they want to apply for asylum in the US. So they want to plead their case. They want to submit themselves to the full vetting process of the most powerful country in the world that claims to be a Christian nation of Christian values and mercy and compassion. And so they believe that. And so they are waiting and submitting themselves to that full process.
I remember, I was just going to say, I remember one of the things that was so helpful to me was in understanding that transition that you just described, when it used to be that the Border Patrol was looking for single men who were trying to sneak in order to make money that they could send back to Mexico, but they weren't necessarily looking to stay in the United States, and they weren't looking to have a status in the United States, and they were just trying to kind of slip through so that they could get some work, which is so different than what you just described. And I remember someone saying that in hiring the Border Patrol, people went in and they thought they were hiring Rambo when they really needed to be hiring Mother Teresa. And that was just this like line that stuck with me, because these Border Patrol agents were kind of ready to like catch the bad guys who might be smuggling drugs or trying to do, these bad things. And then what do they need to do? It's like care for a mother and her child who got lost in the desert and are in danger of dehydration and have been fleeing for their lives. So it's just a really different situation. And that change really did happen somewhat dramatically over the course.
Overnight. Yeah. And you also have such a mismatch there, which you brought up, which is you have law enforcement handling a humanitarian crisis. So instead of treating vulnerable people as a specific vulnerable population, what you're doing is you're trying to meet that humanitarian need with a military response, which is such a mismatch, because you're asking Border Patrol to handle toddlers, and their job is to thwart and find those who would seek to do harm to the country or to enter illegally. So it was such a mismatch in meeting that whole entire influx of migrants trying to come to the US.
Well, and so what do you feel like on the political realm? You just touched on this a little bit. How have things been changing in the last couple of months in terms of President Biden? I know that Obama era policies were overturned by Trump, and I know that some of those were overturned by Biden, but I'm just curious from your view, like what you see happening in the political realm when it comes to especially the southern border.
Well, this is what I would say is that, Women of Welcome, which is the project that I direct, we are a community of Christian women who are looking to enter into this issue from a biblical perspective. What is Christ-like welcome? What is biblical hospitality? And we are a nonpartisan group. We're a nonpartisan advocacy group. So that means that we don't have an agenda other than to look to the scripture as to what does Jesus say about this issue. So immigration for us is a biblical issue. It's not a political issue. And so what that does is it frees us up to engage and enter into this space and speak very transparently and honestly about the policies that are affecting vulnerable people, no matter who's in charge, no matter who the president is. So for instance, during the Obama era, he had mass deportations that were happening and separating families way back during the Obama administration. There was also an implementation of setting up these cage-like facilities and whatnot. And so you have a lot of conservatives that when Trump was utilizing those facilities again, they were saying, well, Obama built the cages. And I guess my response would be, why are we still using them? Like,
right. why are there cages?
Yeah,
who cares who built them?
Yeah, who cares who built them? Why are we still using them? And why is that still, if you're blaming Obama for them, why are they still acceptable under your watch? And they shouldn't. So if our community feels freed up to enter in to the Republican side and to the Democratic side. And frankly, we need advocates on both sides if anything's going to really, some major reform is going to happen. So we just feel very unshackled in that way, that we get to enter in both of those spaces. And I would say that during the former administration with President Trump, there was definitely this heightened rhetoric that was very inflammatory, and a lot of the language that was used was very dehumanizing. And a lot of the policies that he had Stephen Miller create were very, this is where family separation came out of and whatnot. So what we're trying to do is engage from a biblical perspective and keep, no matter who's in office, honest about the humanitarian crisis that has been happening over the last decade at the border. So when we look at the Biden administration, we're more hopeful about what he's proposed. He's definitely trying to push forward some immigration reform. And, we want safe borders. We also want compassionate treatment of those who are made in the image of God. So, the answer is not amnesty and it's not mass deportation. And we actually have a policy that we are trying to garner support for, and it's called restitution-based immigration reform. And
so can you talk about that? What is, tell me, I think this is great to have, because it seems like politically, we tend to often operate in polarities, right? Mass deportation, asylum. And it sounds like you're offering a different type of solution. Can you talk a little bit more about what that might look like?
Yeah. So what that looks like is, when you survey the country, and we have over 11 million folks who are here without status and who are undocumented, the vast majority of those people are actually not those who have crossed a border illegally. Those are the vast majority of people who are here undocumented have overstayed a legal visa that they have applied for. So you have people from Canada, you have people from Africa, you have people from all over the world who have applied to come here, and they've been vetted. And they have been screened, and they have been given permission to come into the country, and then they've overstayed for whatever reason. And so that's a truth. That's a myth that we have to kind of address quite often, is that it's the illegal crossing at our southern border that has gotten us to the place that we have gotten. And that's not actually the case. But what you do have a mix of people who have been in the country for a long time without status. They came for economic opportunity and they've had children here, or they've come on a temporary protected status from another country and they've been here for 10, 20 years. You have dreamers who have been brought into this country as young children, and at no fault of their own, they're here in this country. They've been working, going to school, they have lives. So you have all these families who have mixed status, and it would be family separation all over again to try and figure out who should go where and what should happen. And so restitution-based immigration reform is a proposal that you can find at womenofwelcome.com/reform. And what that is it's a support letter that that you sign on to that lets elected officials know that you would support this solution. And that is that those who have been in the country, and that those who have not committed any crimes, and that can pass a background check, a federal and a local background check, and you can see that they are contributors to the American society and economics and whatnot. So they would go through the full vetting process, and we would screen them. They would then, once they pass that initial screening and vetting, they would pay a fine as restitution for the immigration laws that they have violated. And it's interesting to note, because I didn't know this either, but crossing the border illegally is a misdemeanor, and that's akin to like a speeding ticket. So if you've ever gone over the speeding limit or something like that,
Yeah.
that's what it is. Usually pay a fine. And so what we're proposing is that people would pay restitution for that. And then once they do that, then they get on this educational path to earning permanent status in this country. So there is an addressing of security issues. There's also an addressing of educational issues. And then there's also restitution to pay back something against the misdemeanor that was committed.
And how many people do you, if you know this off the top of your head, would like kind of fall under the umbrella potentially of some sort of restitution solution?
I think the vast majority probably would, for the simple fact that these folks have already been vetted. A lot of them have, because they're overstayed visas.
Right.
But I mean, you do have other mixed status families that have come across the border as well. So it's not to say that they're not in there as well. They definitely are.
Yeah.
But I would say that, all the data shows us that immigrants that come to this country are far less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens.
Yeah.
They are far more likely to increase the economic opportunities and jobs, and even just the pay wage of those in their local communities, because they're hard workers. And that's why they're coming here. They're coming here because they want opportunity to provide for their families. So we see that there's a net plus. I think it's over 90% of economists agree that immigrants are a net plus to the economy. And so you have people who are wanting to come. They're not wanting to get in trouble. They know that if they were to get in trouble, and some of them do, they will get scouted out by ICE and they will be deported. And so, there are some people who are here in this country that shouldn't be, and therefore they should be deported. But this is a proposal that says, all right, come forward, come out of the shadows. And what we will do is we will give you an opportunity to live without fear and to be a part of society in a way that is productive and helpful and healthy for not only your community, but for your family.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. First I want to just, do you know Sarah Quezada's book title off the top of your head?
Love Undocumented.
Love Undocumented. I just want to note that here because it is a great personal story of what you just described in terms of someone overstaying a visa. And because you can hear that from the outside and you're like, well, why'd you do it? Right. And it's like, oh, I see exactly why you did it. Like this makes it just, to me, getting that personal story in the context of this whole conversation was really, really helpful. So I just highly recommend Love Undocumented. It's an easy but really informative read. And it's a beautiful story. So, but then secondly, the other thing that I'm thinking about is, okay, so there are like really pragmatic, take faith out of it. There are really pragmatic reasons to do what you are talking about, right? Like this is better economically. Thinking about like, what is the American dream? It's that you can come to this country if you are courageous and kind of willing to give it a go and look what can happen. It's just, there's so much in keeping with at least one narrative of what it means even to be an American is to come here and to work hard and to contribute to society. But then there's also, and this is moving us into like the heart realm of this conversation, there's also the specific Christian aspect to the work that you are doing and what motivates the work that you are doing. And you've spoken to this a little bit, but I'd love to just hear a little bit more about why should Christians care about this issue? How does the Bible apply to how we think about immigration, how we think about asylum seekers and refugees in particular? How is it a part of the pro-life cause? Like, could you just speak a little bit more to how this is rooted in those kind of heart issues, like the spiritual piece of all of it?
Sure. Well, for Christians, we go back to Genesis 1:27, where where God says that he made man in his image, male and female, he made them in his image. So it's made every person that you see, citizen or not, is made in the image of God and in his likeness, and therefore is deserving of our care, our respect, our concern. The Bible, if we look at it holistically, a lot of Christians feel intimidated by this issue, or they've bought into kind of a fear narrative about this vulnerable populations of immigrants and refugees. And it's interesting that when you look at the whole of Scripture, sometimes as Christians, we like to just pick out a verse that helps us distance ourselves from a specific issue. You say, you know what, like Romans 13 says this, or so-and-so says this. And you just kind of pick this one verse that helps you just like be able to check out. But when we look at the whole of scripture, actually in the Old Testament, there is this kind of, there's a philosopher, I'm forgetting his name right now, but he talks about the quartet of the vulnerable. And basically in the Old Testament, there is this elevation of widows, sojourners, the poor, and orphans. Yeah. And they're talked about more than any other vulnerable population in the Old Testament. So we know that God has mandated his people to have special concern for those vulnerable populations. And then you get to the New Testament, and the Pharisees are looking to test Jesus. And they say, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And he says, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And then the second is this, is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so we are to love God and we're to love others. And we're all in the others category. So it doesn't matter, you know, when you move to this kingdom mindset of what God cares about, you move off of this kind of like country or empire mindset that says citizenship first, America first. Of course, the U.S. has an obligation to take care of its citizens from a safety perspective, from all of the different facets that a country is responsible of taking care of its citizens. But as Christians, we have a different mindset that's supposed to click first. And that is that each and every person that we see is made in the image of God. And therefore, they are deserving of our care and concern. So a lot of people will say to me, with all the needs that we see in the U.S., you have homeless veterans, you've got U.S. school kids who can't, eat lunch. You've got all these issues in the U.S. And now you're telling me I need to care about vulnerable refugees and immigrants that aren't even U.S. citizens. What I would say is, if we're coming at it from a kingdom-minded perspective, that recalibrates how we think about people, how we see people, how we talk about people. And as if the body of Christ is really functioning as they should, we've all got different parts to play. In Matthew, it talks about how some people are an eye and some people are a hand, and that we're not to disregard those different parts of the body, but that we are to basically kind of know each other's pain points and provide coverage for where there are more vulnerable parts of the body. And then we're supposed to honor those more vulnerable parts of the body. So to me, when someone says to me, I should care about American needs first, and they're a Christian, what I would say is, as part of the body, we are to function in a way that we are all meeting the needs of everybody who is made in the image of God. And so my passion doesn't have to be your passion.
Right.
And it frees everybody up to say, okay, so God has given you giftings and talents and experiences that are going to maybe endear you to maybe this vulnerable population. And I've got a calling over here right now. And that might not be forever, but that's over here. So for instance, for me, I started out in the abortion and adoption space.
Yeah.
And then I kind of moved into this immigration, now refugee space. I have a very huge interest in prison ministry and social and justice reform. And so it's like, we're supposed to care about all these things so that we can support each other in our various roles as the entire human body. So I hope that allows people to be freed up to care about multiple things, but still feeling called to a very specific.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's really helpful. And when you were talking, it made me think about, first of all, when Jesus is talking about, he gets pushed back on a little bit, right? Like, but who is my neighbor in terms of what does it mean to love my neighbor? And that's when we get the story of the Good Samaritan, which is very explicitly the person who does not live in your land, right? Like the neighbor is one who has crossed a border, literally. And who does actually, at great cost to himself, cares for the wounded Israelite in this case. Because I think that while there's a lot of statistical data that shows that it's actually not in an American citizen's economic self-interest to welcome people into our country, even if that weren't the case, from a Christian perspective, whether or not this is going to cost you, if you have it to give, guess what? This is your neighbor. Like this is someone who is in need, and you get to be a part of God's work potentially in that. And I think also to Matthew 25, as far as Jesus saying, you are caring for me when you are caring for those who are in prison and who are homeless and who are hungry and who are destitute and all of those things. So I wanted to just one other kind of heart related question. I know you have had a chance to meet with personally and talk to dozens, maybe hundreds of people who are in this very vulnerable position of applying for asylum in the United States. And I do think that putting a human face and some stories to the statistics and even to the Bible verses we're talking about can be really helpful. So I'm just wondering if you can think of a story about someone who is seeking asylum that you'd be willing to share.
Yeah. So I guess one of the stories that has always stuck with me was a man named Carlos. And I think you were there when we were talking with Carlos.
Yeah.
And Carlos was a father. And I believe, was he from Honduras?
I think
he was from the Northern Triangle.
Yeah, he was definitely from the Northern Triangle. And he had, I think, 3 children.
I think he had 2 and then one was on the way.
Okay, one on the way. I just knew one was really little. So maybe, yeah.
And one was on the way. And he and his brother were living in kind of an apartment complex. And they had repeatedly heard their neighbor being violent or abusing kind of his children. And, one day they just had kind of had enough. They had, heard the mom was gone to work and the dad was home with the youngest daughter. And they kind of noticed this and observed this for a little while. And one of the days, the mom had left and they were home in their apartment and they could hear what was happening. This father was abusing his daughter. And they decided they were going to break down the door and save this little girl from the abuse of her father. So he and his brother did that. And so he said, he's a Christian. He said that I was compelled to do that. And if it was my daughter, I would, I was thinking, I have daughters. I could hear this going on and he couldn't let it happen anymore. And so he said, I just trusted God that I was going to insert myself into this and do it. And so they saved this girl. The authorities were called. They saved this girl from her abusive father. Well, what happened is that this father was part of a local gang.
Yeah.
And what ended up happening is he obviously was incredibly upset that the authorities had been called on him. And so the gang started targeting him and his brother. And they nearly took his brother's life. They had gone by his brother's business and they had done drive-by shootings and all, it's just this really violent scene that unfolded because he inserted himself to save this little girl. And he ended up fleeing for his life. He left his wife and his 1 or 2 other kids, and she was pregnant, but yet it was getting so dangerous for him to be there that it was like, I'm either going to die here or I'm going to be able to go and seek asylum in the US, tell that I'm being persecuted, and maybe I can bring my family and we can live in safety. And it was just so interesting to me to sit there and think, here's a young father who came by himself, who was grieving the loss of his family. His wife ended up having their next child without him present. Mm-hmm. So he never met his youngest child. And just the marital challenge that was about her feeling abandoned, but her knowing that he would have died if he stayed, and her having to go through all this by herself. And he's stuck in a migrant shelter because of the policies that are not allowing him to actually really apply for asylum at our border. And so he was just stuck in this limbo and at the mercy of our policies. And what struck me is here's a man who's wanting to submit himself to the full vetting process of the strongest nation in the world. And we're saying, no, we don't want to. Mm-hmm. And we're going to do everything that we can to try and keep you out. And, I used to look at the news stories and the photographs that would come through across the media wires, and you would see these long lines of single men trying to get into the country for whatever reason. And they'd be lined up along a chain link fence. And I remember that I used to look at those long lines and think, wow, that is a group of people that are just looking to take. I remember I used to think that. And then after that, experience with Carlos, I will never look at a long line of single men like that again, like the same. I just won't, because instead I'm seeing them as fathers or husbands. Not all of them belong in the US. And what I mean by that is not everybody is safe to come into the country, but we owe it to people like Carlos. I would want Carlos to be my neighbor.
Yeah.
I would want, that is the kind of man I want in my community,
right,
who is fighting for the vulnerable and is doing it at every cost. It cost him his entire life to enter in and save that girl. And he could have just let it go.
Mm-hmm.
He had a business with his brother. They were fine. And then he laid it all on the line for this little girl that he probably will never, ever see again. Yeah. But he felt compelled by his faith to enter into her story and save her. And now he finds himself in limbo. And so that story has never stuck. It's always stuck with me. And I will never look at a line of immigrants waiting to come in differently. Yeah. I'll never look at a line like that the same. That's what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so taking all this information, taking the stories, taking the biblical mandate, you've given us a little bit of a okay, so what do we do just in talking about the restitution potential, reform that we could go on and just sign. But are there other small steps that people who are listening to this podcast, who are concerned about these issues, but are also just living their ordinary American lives, can take to actually get involved, be supportive, and respond to this information and these stories?
Well, I think the number one question we always get at Women of Welcome is, what can I do?
Sure.
And I think for the American church, a lot of the time, we simply want to have a very quick fix. And immigration is a very complex issue. I mean, I don't even understand all of it. I mean, there's immigration lawyers. There's a specialty in this, you know. It's more complicated than tax law, is what I'm told. So what I would say is there's not a silver bullet. If you're looking for a silver bullet, there's not one. But there are organizations that you can engage with. There are people that need to hear your voice and your compassion towards this issue in order for them to have some confidence in this space as well. So at Women of Welcome, what we say is we're trying to attach confidence to your compassion. And part of that is we're introducing you to people who are in this space that are doing on the ground work and doing a good job. And we do that through our webinars or through our blog. We're also helping you figure out how to speak up. A lot of times, people will feel like it's my civic duty to just vote straight ticket a certain way every 4 years. And really, it's the in-between years that really matter. And so calling your elected officials, how do I do that? How do I speak up well? And we have free resources on how to use your voice well, how to engage your elected officials well. You can find all of that at womenofwelcome.com in our resource section. And we're coming out with a new website in just a couple weeks here. So that will be a great place to engage. But I think that learning, taking the time to enter in and learn, listening to something like this, and then go and we have a plethora of videos. We have come out with new weekly videos every week about this, and start following people that you might not agree with, not because you're going to be deconstructing your own value system by following people, and you don't have to 100% align, but what it would do is it would help you understand a different community, a different area of the world or American society that you might not be immersed in, and that it would just be helpful for you to get in closer proximity to. So I would say learning is a really good one. Be dedicated to learning in the space, and it's going to be like a fire hose, but you can find Women of Welcome would be a great starting point for that. I'd also say, praying is really important. I think people undervalue prayer, and it's let's be praying for the hearts and minds of people to really have a deepened sense of the sanctity and dignity of every human life. And what does that mean as Christians? What are we called to do because that is the truth, and because we believe that, and because scripture tells us that? I mean, you can always donate. I think people are like, where do I donate? Where do I send stuff? Sure. And I think that's kind of the easy work. And there's a plethora of organizations along the border that are helping. There's organizations in countries that are helping out, like A More Just Society is another great organization that works in the Northern Triangle to fight injustices and corruption and keep the government accountable and whatnot. So I think writing a check is very much needed. But I would also say that don't discount your presence, because your presence is also a gift. And you might not think I live in an immigrant rich community or whatever, but you might be surprised. If you were to just simply Google immigrant services in my community or nearby me, you might be surprised to see entities that are very nearby you serving vulnerable populations and folks who are living in the shadows and scared to really immerse and assimilate into society because they're afraid of being judged. There's a lot of shame for being here without status. And so I think learning, praying, I think giving is good, but I also think entering in personally with closer and meeting people is a good one.
And I think the other thing that struck me when we were together on that trip, but one of the things that came up was that the majority of the people who are coming to the United States as immigrants or who are seeking asylum or whatever are actually people of faith. And so there is a shared brother and sisterhood, right? There's a shared family of God aspect of things. And I say that not only in terms of our, obligation to one another, whether that's as humans or as Christians or whatever, but also in terms of, okay, these are people who have done one of what to me is one of the most courageous things I can imagine in leaving my home and going to the unknown and not knowing what's going to happen. And as you said, it happens for all sorts of reasons, but typically at great cost and with great courage. And to have endured that measure of suffering and risk, and to have, for many of them, prayed and known the experience of walking with Jesus through that whole time, how much do I need those people in my life who can speak to what it means to follow God in the midst of hardship and uncertainty and fear and not knowing what's going to happen? I just think that it's easy for me to see this conversation in terms of what I can give. And I just also believe there's so much that we have to receive from those who have different life stories than we do and who've experienced so much. So there's, I love all the things you just said as far as how we can get involved, whether it's by, signing a letter or making a donation, looking in our local communities and just starting to get a lot more information about what's going on. So yeah, go ahead.
I think being curious is really helpful. I think a lot of times you do have immigrants in your midst, but you're not necessarily curious about knowing their story or what they've gone through. And there's very tangible things. Anytime I travel, I'm usually taking an Uber or getting in a taxi. And most of those drivers tend to be immigrants, and they're here seeking asylum, or they're on a green card status, or they've fled persecution of some sort. And, asking them to tell you their story can be a hard thing because a lot of them are fleeing really violent situations. You have to be sensitive about asking people to recall such a traumatic experience. So maybe you don't just dive in all there, but if you notice that somebody has, that either looks different than you or has a dialect or an accent that's different than you, what I will say is that just saying, I noticed you have an accent. Where are you from? Where's your family from? And then you just get into this very natural kind of family conversation and whatnot. And what I would say is there's a large number of immigrants who have never been welcomed into the United States. They've never been told that they're welcome. And I think that's incredibly sad, considering we claim to be a Christian nation, or a nation that holds to Christian values. And to know that the vast majority of immigrants are coming from countries where the majority of people claim to be Christians in those countries. It's not to say everybody that's migrating over is a Christian, but the large majority of countries that people are coming from, most people in that country claim Christ.
Right.
So that for them to come into a quote Christian nation and not be welcomed is really disheartening and sad. And so I think we all have a role and a part to play in being curious about someone's story enough, or curious about an individual enough to be welcoming or to show welcome to someone. And I would just say this, you brought up those who are coming from nations that are either Christian or have predominantly Christian values and views as well. I was at a conference and I heard a pastor say, you know what, the majority of, he's a pastor here in the US. And that's another great thing. You can look for other types of congregations in your community. If you know there's a Hispanic congregation in your, or a Korean congregation in your community, it might be nice just to pop in and sit and see what that's like. That'd be a great experience to have. But he was a pastor of a predominantly Hispanic church in the US. And he said, you know what, the number one thing my congregants want to do? And we were all thinking, like, of course, they want permanent status. They want people to understand them. They want free English classes, like all these things. We're just thinking. And he said, they want to drive to church together in the same car. And we were all kind of like, what does he mean by that?
Why can't they do that?
Why can't they do that? And he said, the majority of people who are here without status have mixed status families. So mom or dad is here without status. And if they were to be picked up on the way driving to church, there'd be a permanent deportation because they're here without status. And so mom and dad are driving in separate cars, splitting up the kids so that only half of the family would be deported if someone got pulled over. And I just got to thinking, like, wow, this is how dedicated some of our immigrant brothers and sisters are to the church, that they are risking family separation, permanent deportation from away from their families to gather with the body of Christ in their community. And doing so, they're driving in separate cars. So he said, my mixed status families want to drive together to church on Sunday mornings. And it just hit me, like, where's our compassion in trying to keep families together? Is that something that we are truly mindful about? Is that something we truly care about? Because when family separation was happening with kids at the border, there's many ways that family separation is happening. And it's not just at the border. It's happening in our own communities as well, with families who love Jesus and who love America and want to be here and be contributors. So just being curious about the people around you that might look differently than you can really put you in a position to show Christ-like welcome in a way that you didn't think was possible.
Well, Bri, thank you so much for just offering a kind of big picture, but also some of those more small details so that we get a better sense of the head, the heart, and the hands when it comes to immigration. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. We made some references to books and articles and such today, so we'll be sure to note those in the show notes. And of course, I'd always love for you to share this episode, subscribe to this podcast, give it a quick rating or review. It's been so fun to hear from some of you on Instagram and on Facebook and through email about your responses to these podcasts. So please keep those coming. I love hearing from you. I did mention at the top that I've got a new paperback version of Head, Heart, Hands. I've also got a paperback version of my ebook, Missing Out on Beautiful, which is a series of reflections about having a child with Down syndrome, written both from my perspective and Penny's perspective, in honor of World Down Syndrome Day, which is on March 21st. I also have a YouTube channel now, so you can look that up. And I always have a lot of thanks to you as my listeners, to Jake Hansen for editing, to Amber Beery for doing social media coordinating in an extraordinary way. Thank you, all the people who support making these conversations happen. And now, as you go into your day today, I hope you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.